The sky split open just after 3 in the morning. No warning, no wind, just a single bolt of lightning straight down onto the roof of the East Bridge meeting house. By the time I made it there, the flames had already eaten through the rafters. Folks tried to fight at bucket lines, hands black with soot, but the place was half gone by sunrise. And when the floor behind the pulpit gave way when they saw what was beneath, I knew right then we were standing on top of something the community had spent generations trying to hide. Before we begin, hit subscribe to help uncover the stories they tried to bury, and make sure no name stays forgotten. My name's Jacob Lance. I was born and raised just outside East Bridge, Pennsylvania. Quiet stretch of farmland where the roads were mostly gravel and the neighbors knew your business before you did. I was 23 that summer, the youngest carpenter working the district circuit. My father Abraham had built barns all over the county, and I'd followed close behind. Not just with a hammer, but with questions too. Questions most folks didn't like to answer. After the fire, it was me and a few other men from the district who were asked to help with restoration. We'd just lost part of the roof, but the sanctuary had held. No pews burned. No hymnals touched. Still, the bishop called it a warning. Said even God's house wasn't beyond correction. The very next morning we got to work. I remember scrubbing char off the walls, hauling timbers in through the south doors. It was quiet labor, the kind that keeps your hands busy and your thoughts somewhere else. The air inside still smelled like wet ash and varnish. The pulpit where the preacher sat had been scorched through at the base. So on the third day we started lifting the stone platform beneath it. That's when we found it. 6 of us heaved that slab out of place. Underneath should have been packed earth or bedrock, that's how it always was. But this time there was a gap. A hollow. A breath of cold air rising from the dark. We all backed off. Even the older men. Eli Stoltzfus, who'd been part of the last restoration back in '74, just stared at it. Wasn't here before, he muttered. I dropped to one knee, aimed my flashlight down into the gap. Stone stairs, old, worn, covered in dust. The bishop arrived within the hour. Didn't say much. Just looked at the opening, his expression flat as always. Then he said, "Seal it." That was it. Like it was nothing. But that night I went back alone. I didn't tell my father. Didn't tell anyone. Just took a lantern and my gloves left my horse tethered at the bend in the road. The stairs went down 23 steps straight into the foundation. At the bottom, the air was thick, stale. I had to duck, the ceiling was low. The walls were rough dirt-packed. No windows, no vents. And against the far wall, 6 stones. Headstones. Not tall, but deliberate. Set into the ground like they belonged there. No names. Just initials. A.K. B.R. C.S. D.H. M.Y. And the last one chipped at the base, E.E. Beneath that last stone, I saw something white curled like old cloth. I brushed it back with my hand. It crumbled. Burial linen. I turned away, heart racing, and saw a shelf cut into the wall. On it sat a leather-bound journal. The pages were swollen with mold, the writing faint but careful. I flipped to the front. March 3rd, 1989. Esther Marie. Age 19. Missing since 1989. Never reported. I stopped reading when I saw the last line on the page. They said my voice was a temptation, They said the child would bring ruin. They said silence was the only way to save the community. I climbed out of that vault with her journal wrapped in a cloth. My hands were shaking. I couldn't sleep. Not that night. Not after what I'd seen. But I didn't know the worst part yet. That came the next morning when the bishop stood in the pulpit, his back to the soot-stained wall, and told the congregation we'd be sealing the foundation for good. Said there was nothing down there worth remembering. That's when I realized someone didn't want her name spoken. And that meant whatever happened down there, it wasn't over. Not yet. I didn't go to work the next morning. I sat in the barn loft instead, the journal still wrapped in the same cloth I'd hidden it in the night before, trying to convince myself I hadn't seen what I knew I had. But the longer I stared at the wood grain beneath my feet, the clearer it all became. The vault, the stones, the cloth, and her name written over and over again in that thin, steady script. Esther Marie. I couldn't stop thinking about the way she'd written dates. Clean. Ordered. Like someone trying to hold on to structure when the rest of the world was falling apart. I waited until the sun came up, then slipped the journal under my mattress and rode back out to the meeting house. The bishop was already there, standing with 2 elders beside the pulpit, eyes on the roof line like it was the only thing that mattered. I kept my head down, carried boards in measured trim, but the whole time my ears were tuned for what they weren't saying. Later that week I went to see Widow Brenneman. She lived in a small house just past the bend near Greer's Hill, not far from the meeting house. She'd been the midwife for our district when I was little. Her sight was failing, but her memory wasn't. She answered the door holding a lantern like she'd been expecting me. "You look like your father," she said, then paused. But he knew when to leave things alone. I told her what we'd found the stones, the initials, the journal. Her face didn't change. She just said, "Then you found what the rest of us were told to forget." I asked her if she'd known Esther. She nodded once. "I heard her scream," she said. "Just once. Then never again." I asked why no one spoke up. She shook her head. They did. But only once. The bishop had told them she'd been sent away. That she was carrying shame. That they should pray for her soul and turn their eyes from sin. That night I returned to the journal. The entries were getting harder to read. Not because of the handwriting that stayed careful, but because of what she was describing. April 1st, 1989. They made me kneel. Elder King recited from Deuteronomy. My sin was named aloud before the women, but not the fathers. They acted like he didn't exist. Like I'd conjured the baby from dust and rebellion. A week later she wrote, "I bled yesterday, not from the child, from punishment. They made me scrub the altar steps for hours while reciting Psalm 51. When I slowed, Elder King struck the back of my legs with a wooden rod. I don't think my father stopped him. I don't think he blinked." The last entry before the ink faded was dated May 5th. "They will take me to the vault soon. I know it." The next time I returned to the vault, I brought a trowel. I worked slow, careful digging near the grave marked E.E. The others had seen disturbed soil. I'd noticed it that first night, but this one was different. Not just unsettled, but preserved. 6 inches down my trowel struck something solid. A bone. Curved, small like a rib. 10 inches deeper, I found what was left of a coffin corner, rotted through but still shaped. Inside it was cloth brittle with age and a silver cross on a chain. Then the curve of a jawbone, the teeth still intact. I stopped right there. I didn't need to see more to understand what I was looking at. Someone had been buried here, and they'd been hidden, not lost, not honored hidden. The next morning, I called the county coroner's office from the payphone behind Fisher's feed supply. I didn't give my name, just told them what I'd found, but it was already too late to contain. Someone had overheard me on the call. A worker. Said he didn't mean to eavesdrop, but caught enough to make a second call of his own. Within 24 hours, the Lancaster County Sheriff's Office arrived at the meeting house. They said it was a building inspection, but the gear told a different story. Plain clothes, rubber gloves, evidence kits. Sheriff Dolores Rankin came in just after dawn. She didn't look surprised, just tired, like someone who'd seen too many small towns hold too many secrets. She walked me through what I'd found. I told her everything. The vault, the stones, the journal, the box. When she asked if I'd disturbed the remains, I said no, not really. Just brushed the soil back. She nodded. "You know, disturbing human remains is a felony," she said. I nodded back. "Yes, ma'am. I do now." By noon, the vault had been declared a potential crime scene. Forensics teams cataloged every inch the initials on the stones, the journal, the cloth, the soil. 5 of the 6 graves showed signs of disturbance. The 6th, the one marked EE, was the only one still intact. The remains inside were confirmed human, female, young. There were signs of trauma, a fractured tibia, malformed ribs, a jaw with a cracked molar. The silver cross was tagged, bagged, and logged. Meanwhile, the bishop held a closed meeting at his house. My father was invited. I wasn't. When he came home that evening, he didn't speak. Just sat at the table with his hands folded tight, eyes locked on the wood grain. I asked what they talked about. He didn't answer. Later that night, I climbed into the attic of our barn. My father kept the old district logs there, births, deaths, marriages, excommunications. I sat cross-legged with a kerosene lamp and flipped through page after page. From 1970 to 1990, nothing. No EE listed, but in the back, marked in red ink, schism records. June 1989, Esther Marie Esch, age 19, unwed, expelled for fornication and refusal to repent. No further record. She was real. She had a name, and they'd buried her without ever speaking it aloud. The next day, I visited the county records office. I told the clerk I was researching family history, asked about an Esther Marie Esch born around 1970. She found it fast. Born April 11th, 1970. Parents Abraham and Leah Esch. Lived on Fairview Road. No death certificate. No marriage. No hospital records after 1989. Just a blank space where her life should have kept going. I asked if the family was still in the area. The father had passed in 92. The mother had gone into care a few years later. The farm was sold in 1995. I thanked her and left with a copy of the birth certificate tucked into my coat pocket. That evening, Sheriff Rankin called. They'd run partial DNA from the remains. It matched the Esch family line. Not perfectly just a cousin who'd submitted to a genealogy database, but close enough. So it's her I asked. Almost certainly, she said. But that's not all. The journal, she said, mentioned a cleansing ritual. She asked what that meant. I told her. Quietly. When someone broke the Ordnung, the rules in a way that shamed the whole district, especially girls. If they were pregnant, if they refused to repent, they were isolated. Sometimes they were just gone. She was silent a long time. Then she said, "We believe Esther died from blunt force trauma to the head and pelvis, likely during a struggle. It wasn't an accident." I didn't argue. "No," I said. It wasn't. The next Sunday, the bishop preached beneath a fresh crossbeam. The pulpit had been rebuilt, the walls scrubbed clean. No one mentioned the vault, no one spoke Esther's name. But I knew now. I knew where she'd been buried, and I knew that I couldn't let them seal it again. Not this time. The day after that, a letter appeared under my door. No return name, just a piece of folded paper. The message was typed. One sentence. "You've stirred something dangerous." The vault was always deeper than they said. "There's another room beneath the stones." I didn't tell anyone about the letter at first. I just read it twice, folded it back up, and slid it into the back of the journal where Esther had written her last words. The pages were already stained soft at the edges, but the letter sat there stiff and clean, like it didn't belong. "There's another room beneath the stones." I stared at that line until the lantern burned out beside me. It didn't sound like a threat. It sounded like someone who knew something and couldn't hold it in any longer. By morning, I was back at the meeting house. I waited until the workers cleared out for the day, then slipped through the rear door with a canvas bag and my gloves. I moved slow. The stone floor was colder than I remembered. The vault still smelled of dirt and something older. The 6 headstones were where we'd left them, initials only. No names, no dates, no grace. I crouched beside the last one. E.E. The grave we'd opened. The one that still had a voice. I ran my fingers along the ground, feeling for any uneven seams or changes in the soil. Most of it was packed undisturbed. But near the back wall behind the 6th grave, I felt something different. A shallow dip in the dirt, just a few inches lower than the rest. The outline of a square, maybe 2 feet across. I tapped it gently with the handle of my trowel. Hollow. Not rock, not soil. Something below. I marked the edges in chalk and brought the tools down. A pry bar. A wooden wedge. Flashlight. It took almost an hour to loosen the edges, lifting just enough to wedge the stone up from beneath without cracking it. When it gave, the whole slab shifted with a low groan, like something in the earth didn't want to let go. Beneath it, a narrow shaft dropped straight down, maybe 10 feet. At the bottom, a rusted iron ladder disappeared into darkness. I didn't go down. Not that night. I sealed it back and swept the chalk lines clean before I left. But I knew then the vault was only the start. The next day, I went to see someone I hadn't spoken to since I was a teenager. Widow Lydia Zook lived alone on the far edge of Greer's Hollow in a house that leaned slightly to one side from too many winters and too little care. She opened the door before I knocked. "I knew you'd come," she said. "The wind's been unsettled since the fire." She moved slow, motioning me toward a kitchen table covered in sewing scraps and oil lamp soot. I didn't ask questions right away. She poured tea. We sat in silence for a few minutes while the kettle hissed in the corner. Then she said, "What did you find?" I told her everything. The stones, the journal, the bones, the child, the letter. Her eyes didn't waver. "I remember Esther," she said after a long pause. She had a laugh like running water. You could hear it from the lane when she passed. Then one day it was just gone. I asked if anyone ever told her what happened. She nodded. They said she'd been sent away. But the night she vanished, I heard something. Dragging. Like something heavy being pulled across a wooden floor. No horses. No carriage. Just gone. I left her house just before dusk, hands cold and shaking. I knew I couldn't wait any longer. That night after midnight, I returned to the vault. This time I brought rope, a second lantern, and a satchel with gloves, a knife, and a notepad. The shaft opened easy, the slab lighter, now that I knew where to grip. I tied the rope to one of the stone braces and lowered myself in. The iron rungs creaked under my weight but held. 10 feet down, I hit ground. The space below wasn't stone, it was clay. Damp and uneven. The walls were cut from packed earth, reinforced in places with old barn wood and scrap timber. The air smelled like rot and mold. In the center of the room was a stone slab stained dark. Not cracked like the one above. This one was intact. A rusted chain lay bolted to the floor beside it, the ring warped like it had been pulled hard. Off to one side was a pile of cloth crumpled and brittle. A bonnet mostly intact sat on top. Nearby, the wooden frame of a child's doll, just the core, and the eyes stared up from the dirt. I didn't speak. I took photos of every surface, every mark, every item. I kept the lantern low and steady. This wasn't a burial site. It was something else. A place someone was kept. A place someone was punished. And it wasn't just used once. The chain, the staining, the absence of names. It was built to be hidden. When I came back up, I sealed the shaft again and brushed the dust back into place. Then I called Sheriff Rankin. I used the landline at the back of the woodshop. I found something I said. She didn't ask much. Just asked if I could keep it sealed for 2 days. Said she'd come herself. No uniforms, no lights, just her. When she arrived that Friday night, I led her through the dark church without speaking. She didn't flinch when she saw the vault again. She just followed me down. We pried the stone back together, lowered the ladder, and she went in first. Her flashlight cut through the dark, glinting off the chain and the slab. She crouched low, examined the walls. She didn't speak for a long time. When she climbed back out, her face had changed. "We'll need a warrant," she said. I nodded. "Can you keep it sealed for 48 hours?" I said yes. She looked at me. "If this is what I think it is, Jacob, we're not just dealing with murder. This might be something else entirely. Something organized. Maybe even sanctioned." By Monday morning, the vault was a declared crime scene. The forensics team came quiet in unmarked vans. No uniforms, no press, just boots on stone and bags of equipment. I stood off to the side while they moved through the old foundation. Lights were set up, photos taken, dirt tested. One of the forensic leads, Dr. Fry, ran a scanner across the center slab. "It's blood," she said. "Old but human. And not just spatter. It's soaked in." She pointed to where the droplets clustered at the southern edge. Multiple trajectories. This wasn't symbolic. It was violent. The chain had signs of impact. The cloth was confirmed handmade. A child's bonnet. The bone fragments they found beneath the slab weren't just from adults. One of them, smaller than a thumb, was a molar. A baby tooth. I stepped back when she said that. Couldn't speak. Sheriff Rankin asked quietly, "Could someone have been born down here?" I didn't answer right away, but we both knew what it meant. Esther hadn't been buried alone. And this place, this hidden room, wasn't a relic. It was a chamber, a containment cell, built beneath a house of worship, used again and again. Later that day, the sheriff called the State Bureau. Within 24 hours, the site was under federal jurisdiction. They brought in radar tent security. The bishop called it desecration. I called it justice. But even then, we didn't know how far it went. Because that night, after everyone left, I walked back to the house and opened Esther's journal again. I flipped to the entry I'd marked in the back. May 3rd, 1989. I begged them not to take the baby. They said it would not survive outside shame. They said it was better if it never drew breath. I named her Anna, even if no one else will say it. The page was smudged, but the name was clear. And I remember whispering it out loud just once, sitting alone in that barn while the wind pushed through the wheat. Anna. It was the first time I'd said it. It wouldn't be the last. After the site was sealed and the press got wind of what we'd found, it all moved faster than I could process. By the end of that week, federal agents were walking the same floors where I used to sweep up sawdust, and men with clipboards were marking every wall and beam like the past could be mapped out in angles and measurements. I should have felt relieved. Instead, I felt like I'd cracked something open that didn't want to be touched. I still worked my father's shop during the day, cutting joints and sanding boards like nothing had changed, but I wasn't really there. My thoughts kept circling the same questions. Why 6 graves? Why only initials? And why did everyone act like none of it had happened? I'd watch the trucks pull away from the meeting house at night and feel like the story was folding itself back in, like the silence was already trying to take hold again. At night, I read the journal. Not just once or twice, but front to back over and over until the ink patterns started living in my head. Esther's handwriting had shifted partway through. It got smaller, tighter, as if she'd started conserving space or bracing for what she knew was coming. There was an entry dated April 14th that caught my eye. She mentioned another girl, a visitor from a nearby district. Miriam Yoder, only 15. Esther wrote that Miriam had seen the vault once. Not the burial room, but the hidden space beneath the one with the chain and the slab. She'd told Esther to be careful, that some girls didn't come back after going down there. Miriam's name wasn't in the logs I'd found, but her initials were on one of the stones in the vault. M.Y. And suddenly I had 2 names. 2 girls. Both vanished. Both buried beneath a church that never spoke of them again. I started pressing gently testing conversations in town, asking the older men if they remembered who rebuilt the meeting house floor after the roof repairs in the 70s, whether anything odd had ever turned up during the original foundation work. Most said no. A few hesitated before answering, but no one offered a memory that helped. I tried one more visit to Widow Brenneman just to see if the name Miriam stirred anything, but she only shook her head. Said she remembered the face, not the fate. I started sleeping less. Not out of fear, just restlessness. A sense that whatever we'd found wasn't the whole of it. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone knew more. One afternoon I returned to the attic of my father's barn where the old church logs were stored. I wanted to check something I hadn't looked at closely before. Not the birth or death records this time, but the disciplinary logs. They weren't labeled directly, just thin ledgers tucked behind the main rosters. I flipped to the volume dated 1988 to 1990. Most of it was expected attendance marks, fasting reminders, notices of excommunication. But in the spring of 1989, I found a stretch of entries that made my chest tighten. March AK expelled for violating courting boundaries. March again, BR excommunicated, pregnant, refused to name the father. April CS removed a caretaker family in Indiana, confirmation never received. May DH repeated infractions, last seen May 4th. May 5th. E confirmed deceased note internal cause. Entry closed. No coroner listed. No burial record. Just a string of dismissals and disappearances, each barely more than a line. I took photos of every page, closed the book, and climbed down the ladder with my stomach in knots. I brought the photos to Sheriff Rankin the next morning. She sat in silence while I laid them out across her desk. Her eyes scanned each line slowly, jaw tight. When she got to the final page, she tapped the words internal cause with the edge of her pen. That's how they recorded a death, she said. No autopsy, no report. Just a note. I nodded. They don't involve outside law. They don't challenge the bishop. She leaned back. Jacob, we have a journal. Bones. A list of names that match initials on hidden graves. This isn't just concealment. This is a coordinated record of removal. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. She already knew. The next Sunday, Bishop Glick stepped into the pulpit and made an announcement. He said the vault would be sealed, filled with concrete. No marker. No name. He said it had been misunderstood that it was a prayer room used in times of spiritual hardship, that we had confused tradition for crime. I sat in the back row near the door. He didn't look at me, but his words felt aimed in my direction. After service, no one said a word, just filed out in silence like nothing unusual had been spoken. But it was too late to seal anything. Too many people had seen. Too many whispers had started to thread through the community. That night, someone slipped another note under my door. No envelope, no name, just one line. You stirred something dangerous. We tried to stop it once before. There's another room beneath the stones. It was the third time that phrase appeared. Another room. I returned to the vault at dawn hours before the work crews were due. I ran my hands over every inch of floor near the back wall past the sixth grave. Most of it was packed clay, undisturbed. But in the far corner, just near where the lantern shadows stopped, I felt a dip, a subtle unevenness. Brushed away the surface dust, and saw it faint outlines of a slab that didn't match the rest of the stonework. My trowel rang hollow when I tapped it. I marked the edges, then came back after sunset with my pry bar. This one came loose easier than the last. Beneath it a shaft, narrow, cut clean into earth. I lowered my lantern. The light dropped past the rung of an old iron ladder, 10 feet, maybe more. At the bottom, it opened into darkness. I didn't go in that night. I resealed the hatch and swept the dust back over it. I needed to know what I was walking into. Someone had built this to stay hidden. but someone else had wanted me to find it. I needed answers, not from logs or letters, from memory, from someone who'd lived through it and was still breathing. That evening, I walked to a house no one visited anymore. A woman named Lydia Zook lived there. Widow, kept to herself. She'd been a district wife back in the 1960s, long before I was born. Her husband died in a barn fall, her daughter in childbirth, and she hadn't spoken in a service since before I was old enough to shave. But when I knocked, she opened the door without asking who I was. Just looked at me soft-eyed. "I knew you'd come," she said. "I knew when the wind changed." She sat me at her kitchen table, poured tea without speaking. The place smelled like wool and wood polish. I asked her about 1989. I asked if she remembered Esther. She nodded once, then stared at her tea. Esther had a laugh like creek water. I could hear it from my window when she passed. Then one day it stopped. I asked what they told her. She said the same as the others sent away for her shame. I asked if she believed it. She didn't answer, just tightened her hand around the cup and said, "The night before she vanished, I heard dragging. Something heavy, slow, across the meeting house floor. No horses, no carriage, just dragging. Then nothing. You think that vault was the end of it?" she said, looking up at me. It wasn't. It was just the beginning. I walked home through fields that didn't feel familiar anymore. The barn lights from my father's property flickered in the distance, but I didn't go in. I sat in the orchard instead, under the oldest tree, and turned the letter over in my coat pocket. Beneath the stones, another room. If she was right, and in my gut I knew she was, then whatever was buried down there had been built long before Esther, built for something worse than silence. The next night I opened the shaft. This time I went down. The air shifted the moment I crossed beneath the stone. Cooler, heavier. Like whatever had been buried down there was still breathing faint and steady just beneath the surface. My lantern flickered as I climbed down the metal of the ladder, colder than I expected. The drop was about 12 feet, just enough to make the descent feel final. I stepped into a narrow corridor cut from packed earth barely wide enough for my shoulders. No boards, no brick, just clay walls veined with moisture and the smell of something old. The floor sloped downward, and every step echoed with a dull, hollow hush that didn't sound like it should have belonged under a church. The hallway ended at a wooden door warped and dark with age. No handle, just a latch fashioned from bent iron. I paused, lantern in one hand, gloved fingers resting on the latch. There was no reason to go further, not without backup. But I didn't move, just listened. Behind the door, I didn't hear anything living. No movement, no breathing, just stillness. I lifted the latch and pushed. The room was larger than I expected. Maybe 15 by 20 feet, dug low with cross beams holding the ceiling steady. There were hooks in the beams, 6 of them, evenly spaced. Not for tools, these weren't a tradesman's hooks. They were iron, looped tight like restraint points. Along the far wall stood a wooden cabinet, half rotted. The doors hung open. Inside were folded cloths, thick leather straps, a wooden rod, and what looked like a hand-bound ledger sealed in oilskin. I left it for now. I moved slowly through the room, letting the light sweep from side to side. On the floor I saw grooves, long, shallow marks in the dirt like something or someone had been dragged across it. In the back corner, a section of the wall had crumbled, revealing a narrow cavity about waist high. I crouched and held the lantern closer. Inside, something was buried in the clay, a small object metal still catching light beneath the grime. I used my pocket knife to scrape it loose. It was a locket. The clasp had rusted shut, but with a little pressure it gave. Inside was a faded photo, two girls no older than 12 or 13 standing beside what looked like a split-rail fence. One had long braids and a serious face. The other was smiling eyes, bright hands folded like she'd been taught not to fidget. I didn't recognize either of them. There were no names inside the locket, just an old pressed daisy and the faint outline of initials LM and RS. The initials didn't match any of the graves we'd uncovered. These girls weren't in the logs. They weren't in Esther's journal. They weren't recorded at all. I sat there in the dirt for a while, the locket in one hand, trying to think, trying to place them. Then I remembered something buried deep in the middle of Esther's journal. A brief entry from the fall of 1988. She'd written about two girls taken from another district for disobedience. Said they'd been brought for correction. She didn't name them, but she described them. The younger was loud, refused to kneel. The elder prayed without sound. I saw them only once. She said they'd been taken into the lower room. Not the vault. Something deeper. I never saw them again. I put the locket in my bag and walked back to the cabinet. The ledger inside was wrapped tight in oilskin and sealed with a thin strand of twine. I untied it carefully and unfolded the cover. The pages were stiff but intact, each one dated, each one listing names, initials, birth years, and fractions. The entries were clinical, cold. No emotion, just cataloging. July 1985. RS. Brought from Pine Hollow District. Refused penitence. Restrained for 7 days. Outcome returned to father with marks. July 1985. LM. Sister. Confessed. Assigned to cleaning. Removed after 3rd week. Outcome withheld. That word stopped me. Withheld. It showed up again. August 1986. SV. Local unwed. 6 months pregnant. Withheld. October 1987. MY. Continued refusal. Withheld. I flipped forward, scanning page after page. The last entry was dated May 6, 1989. Just after Esther's final journal entry. EEE. Exposed sin. Rebellious. Concealed pregnancy. Cleansing failed. Withheld. I closed the book. When I climbed back up into the vault, the night felt colder. The edges of the stone walls looked sharper than they had before. I resealed the opening, brushed the clay back over the slab, and left without turning back. That evening, I brought the ledger to Sheriff Rankin. I didn't explain everything over the phone. Just told her I had something she needed to see in person. She met me behind the feed store after hours away from the road in the kind of quiet that made conversations feel heavier. I handed her the ledger still wrapped. She opened it slowly, flipping page after page without speaking. After a long silence, she said, "These aren't deaths. Not officially." They didn't even use the word. I nodded. They didn't need to. The ones who wrote this knew no one would ask. She looked at the page again. This isn't just abuse. This is organized containment, documented, sanctioned. She turned another page. Withheld. She repeated. What do you think that meant I didn't answer? We both already knew. That night, I couldn't sleep. I laid in the barn loft with Esther's journal in one hand and the ledger beside me. I read them in parallel. Esther had described the smell of the lower room, the hooks in the beams, the prayers recited during punishment, the way the elders watched but never spoke. The ledger matched all of it, entry for entry, the stories aligned like coordinates. But there was one thing the ledger didn't explain. On the back page, there was a symbol, not a name, not a date, just a mark. A circle drawn in ink with 6 short lines radiating outward almost like a sun. It didn't appear anywhere else in the book, just there alone on the last page. I traced it with my finger, wondering if it was a signature, or a seal, or something older than that. I didn't recognize it, but the lines didn't feel random. I took a photo and sent it to Rankin. A minute later, she called me. We've seen that mark before, she said. Back when I was a deputy, there was a cold case. A girl from a Mennonite farm just outside Elkton disappeared in 1983. No witnesses, no trace. But her sister kept a prayer book with that exact mark etched in the back. No one could place it. We thought it was just a doodle, but I don't think it was. I looked back at the journal, at the letter tucked inside it, at the folded page with the phrase I'd now seen 3 times. Another room beneath the stones. I thought we'd reached the bottom, but maybe we hadn't. Maybe we were still falling. The next morning, I went back to the ledger. I stared at that symbol again, 6 short lines fanned out from a circle. It wasn't decorative, and it didn't look like any maker's mark I'd seen in a carpenter's book. The lines weren't symmetrical. Each point looked like it had been added by a different hand. I thought maybe it was a map, some sort of diagram. But when I traced it again and laid it beside the vault layout I'd sketched in the barn, something about the positioning started to click. Each spoke might have marked something buried. Not people, places, hidden locations. Maybe rooms like the one I'd already found. And maybe if I was right, there were others. I didn't say anything to Sheriff Rankin yet. I wanted to be sure. I spent the next few nights cross-referencing. Esther's journal, the burial logs, the ledger, even old blueprints I'd found rolled up in the barn rafters. My father kept everything even after the fires in '78. There wasn't much on the vault, but I found a floor plan from 1951 that showed a sub-cellar beneath the western foundation, just a faint outline, no access point marked. I hadn't noticed it before. It wasn't in any of the recent diagrams the district used. I mapped it out as best I could, overlaid it on the symbol, and realized the old line pointed almost directly west of the vault. If there was another hidden space, it would be buried behind the retaining wall tucked beneath the slope where the school once stood before they cleared it in the late '60s. I didn't have the tools to get through stone, not without drawing attention. So I waited until Sunday when everyone was at evening service. The western slope wasn't fenced and the brush had grown high around the base. I came through the cornfield dragging a narrow spade and a hand auger in a canvas sack. I worked for hours cutting into the hillside, watching for changes in the soil. Just when I was ready to give up, the spade caught something hard, flat, and smooth. I cleared it with my hands. Concrete. Poured not natural. About 4 feet by 4 feet. I tapped around the edges and found a seam. A square panel. same size as the one I'd opened beneath the pulpit. My chest tightened. I marked the corners and came back 2 nights later just after midnight. I didn't dig this time. I brought a cold chisel, a hammer, and a lantern. It took nearly an hour to lift the hatch. When it finally gave, the lid swung open on rusted hinges. I lowered the light slowly. Another shaft, narrow, deep. I couldn't see the bottom. I tied a line to the nearest fence post, wrapped it around my waist, and climbed down. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Not the quiet kind, the kind that presses in like weight, like the air's gone thick with something you can't name. The walls down here were reinforced with stone, not dirt. Older construction. Rough but deliberate. I walked forward, ducking as the ceiling dropped low. The tunnel curved to the right, then opened into a space I still have trouble describing. It wasn't a room. It wasn't a chamber. It felt more like a tomb someone had tried to disguise as a basement. The walls were covered in lime wash, flaking in places. Along one side, wooden shelving bowed under the weight of rotting paper prayer books, ledgers, and unlit candles that had melted into their holders. On the opposite side stood a row of wooden crates, 6, maybe 7, all sealed. I didn't open them, not yet. I moved toward the far wall where something caught the lantern's reflection. A mirror. Cracked old, mounted chest high. Below it a table. And on the table a white cloth folded with care. I brushed it back and found a set of children's shoes. Polished. Too clean for how far underground they were. Tucked between the shoes was a paper tag. No writing. Just the mark again circle and 6 lines. Below the table a small drawer. I slid it open and found a single photograph. A girl, maybe 8, standing beside a horse fence. Not smiling. Just looking at the camera with a kind of quiet that didn't feel childlike. I turned the photo over. One line in faded pencil. She saw too much. I sat down on the stone floor and just held it there. That's when I heard it. Not a voice, not footsteps, just breath. A shift in the air that said I wasn't alone. I rose slowly, lantern raised. The sound came from beyond the crates. I moved toward them, every step feeling like I was walking into water. I turned the corner and stopped. The tunnel continued, a narrow corridor leading deeper. No lights, no markings, just the same stale air, the same weight pressing in. I backed out. I didn't follow it, not that night. When I got home, I locked the photo and the shoes in my old footlocker beneath the bed. I wrote down everything I'd seen, drew the room, marked the crates, the tunnel, the photo. Sheriff Rankin called just before sunrise. She sounded tense. There was a break-in at the district records hall. Nothing major taken. But the archive cabinet's been opened. A few pages torn out. I asked if anything from 1989 was missing. She paused. You knew before you asked. I met her that afternoon and gave her the photo and the map I'd drawn. She held the shoes in her hands longer than I expected, like the weight of them meant something different in daylight. Then she asked if I'd gone all the way in. I told her no, that there was more. Another tunnel. She nodded. We're not going back alone. We need a team, protective orders, a forensic pathologist. This is larger than burial concealment now. This is systemic isolation, intergenerational. She stopped there, and maybe worse. Later that week, a box showed up on my father's porch. No label, no sender. Inside was a folded length of black cloth. A woman's dress. hand-stitched, worn. In the hem, something sewn tight. I worked it loose and pulled out a slip of paper. One sentence written in looping script. She still sings when the lamps go out. That night I couldn't bring myself to go inside. I stayed in the barn. The smell of cedar and hay, the feel of familiar boards underfoot, it was the only place that still felt real. But even there, the quiet didn't settle. It pulsed like something was waiting beneath the floor. I didn't know then that the crates in that second chamber weren't the last, that the ledger didn't contain every name, that the path I hadn't followed into that narrow, black tunnel led not just to the truth, but to the first voice that had ever tried to tell it. We returned to the chamber with 3 people. Rankin, a forensic pathologist out of Clay County, and a state officer who didn't say much beyond what was necessary. The crates were opened one by one. Inside, lined with straw and thick muslin, were personal items. Some held shoes. Others had clothing, small dresses. Bonnets, a child's blanket embroidered with initials so faint they had to be traced under light. One crate held nothing but buttons. Another, a cracked ceramic bowl sealed in waxed paper. Rankin catalogued each piece with a kind of quiet that told me she was moving through it slowly on purpose, not letting her hands rush ahead of what her eyes were still trying to make sense of. I stood back until the last crate. That one was different. Inside was a glass jar sealed tight and packed with yellowed paper. When I held it to the lantern, I saw lines of writing, small and uneven, wrapped around itself like a coil. It wasn't dated, but I knew what it was. We broke the seal at the barn that evening. The paper had fused at the edges, but we peeled it back, slowly flattening it against the oak table my father had built when I was a boy. The ink had faded in places, but most of it was legible. The handwriting wasn't Esther's. It was smaller, more careful. I read the first few lines aloud. They said we were not to speak. But when the lights go out, I hear her. She sings the song from school, the one about bluebirds and bells. I think her name was Rachel. I stopped reading there. Rankin took over, voice steady. Each paragraph listed moments, meals, prayers, punishments, the names of girls who came and went. Some were marked with stars, others with nothing at all. Near the end, the writer described a tunnel, narrow, unfinished, and said they'd crawled through it once, just far enough to find a grate at the end. I could see their feet. Church shoes. They didn't know I was watching. 2 days later, we got a name. The handwriting matched a sample in a school file from 1987 Rebecca Lorne. She was 12 when she disappeared. Records said she moved districts. No forwarding contact, no family follow-up. But her journal was there sealed in that jar buried inside a crate in the dark. Sheriff Rankin filed the official request for excavation. The state declined, said the site didn't meet criteria. Too unstable. No credible threat to public safety. She filed again. This time under public interest. Again denied. That's when she went quiet. For almost a week, nothing. Then she showed up at my door just after sundown, holding a folder with no markings. She handed it to me without a word and sat down at the kitchen table like she'd been there before. I opened the folder. Inside were copies of incident logs from a nearby station, black and white photos of burned documents, and a single page from an interview transcript. The interviewee's name was redacted, but the voice was unmistakable. Father Gerald. Father. The transcript dated back to 1990, just months after the last ledger entry. There were layers, he'd said. The ones you saw were the quiet ones. But below that, there were others. The ones brought in silence. We called them the withheld. When asked what that meant, he didn't answer, just repeated the phrase, "The withheld are protected." The rest of the transcript was missing. I looked up at Rankin. She said, "He confessed to nothing, claimed it was metaphor, doctrine, but we never found those children, never found records of transfer. Only Esther's journal ever hinted." I asked how many. She said the last estimate was 18, possibly more. We went back one last time, just the two of us. We followed the tunnel behind the crates. It narrowed quickly, barely shoulder-width walls, damp and close. The floor dipped. After 20 yards, we reached a grate set into the stone. Heavy iron bars rusted through at the base. Beyond it, another room. Rounder. No shelves, no crates. Just walls painted in chalk symbols, stars, circles, names repeated over and over. At the center, a stone pedestal. No markings, no objects. Just a patch of clean earth surrounding it undisturbed. I pushed the gate. It gave. The hinges shrieked. We stepped inside. The sound of our breathing echoed oddly, like the room was deeper than its dimensions allowed. We walked the perimeter. Rankin touched the wall where a name appeared 6 times, Marla C. Age 10. Marla C. Age 10. Marla C. Age 10. No last name. No date. Just the age over and over, like a child trying not to be forgotten. Near the pedestal, we found another sealed jar. This one was smaller. Inside was a lock of hair and a strip of linen. Nothing written, no tag. Just a sense immediate and overwhelming that someone had left it as proof. Or plea. That was the last time we entered. The following week, a federal order came down, site closed. Grounds sealed. Investigation suspended. Rankin was reassigned. Quietly. No press release, no statement. She left me a single voicemail before her number was disconnected. They won't dig. Not because it's false, but because it's true. That night, I sat on the porch of the farmhouse. The air was heavy. Crickets loud enough to drown thought. I looked out toward the slope, toward the brush that now covered both entrances. I couldn't see the stones anymore, but I knew they were still there. And I knew beyond all the files and denials and silence that someone else did too. Because 2 days later, another envelope arrived. Inside was a photo. 2 girls standing by a split-rail fence. This time, only one was smiling. It was 2 weeks before the full investigation was reopened. Not by the state, not by the district, but by a private legal group out of St. Louis, family funded as far as I could tell, though they kept quiet about names. All I know is someone with reach got hold of that last photo. The one with the 2 girls by the fence. And someone recognized one of them, not from any missing persons report, but from a family Bible passed down in a home 3 counties over. Her name was listed beneath a birth date. 1976. No death recorded. No forwarding school either. Just a sudden break in the line. The family said they'd been told she'd been adopted. Fostered out after their cousin passed in a car wreck. Only problem was the cousin never existed. And the girl. Her name was Anna. Anna Claire. The legal group didn't wait for permission. They filed federal injunctions and brought in an independent survey crew. They had blueprints, ground-penetrating radar, private forensics. Everything the local district had refused to pursue. And within 72 hours, they confirmed what Rankin and I already knew. There were more chambers, more than 36 square spaces beneath the old foundation sealed beneath layers of poured stone. Most of them empty, but 2 of them weren't. The team found evidence of biological material, trace hair fragments of fabric. No full remains, but enough to prove occupancy. Enough to establish that these were not architectural voids or storm cells. They were containment spaces. They'd been used. Rankin came back for the press conference, though she didn't speak. The lawyer for the group, an older man named David Wexler, read from a prepared statement. He confirmed that the structures were unregistered, unregulated, and fell outside all standard educational building codes. He confirmed that multiple records from 1984 through 1991 had been altered or destroyed. And he confirmed that several faculty members tied to the original church-run boarding school were still alive, living under changed names in neighboring towns, working quietly in administrative roles at other private institutions. When the reporters asked how many children were confirmed missing, Wexler didn't give a number. He said, "That is not a count I'm prepared to give today, because we're not done reading the journals." They found 4 more buried in sealed canisters behind the chapel wall. Each one wrapped in cloth, tied with twine stored upright, as if waiting to be returned. The writing matched 3 separate hands. All female. All young. The details were incomplete dates, jumbled names obscured with nicknames or symbols. But one entry stood out. It described a girl named Ellie who sang too loud during evening prayers. She was made to sleep alone beneath the circle where no light reached her. The next entry, written by someone else, said, "We didn't hear her again." At the same time, records began surfacing from a retired nurse who'd worked part-time at the boarding facility in the early 80s. Her name was Florence Murray. She came forward voluntarily, bringing a box of attendance logs, meal schedules, even incident reports that had never been filed with the county. Some of the names matched the ones we'd seen on the chalk walls underground. Others had never been recorded at all. But the clearest connection came from one log dated March 17, 1983. It listed 17 children checked in. By the following week, the count dropped to 11. No transfer forms, no exits, just red lines through the names. That box was turned over to federal authorities, and still no official charges were filed. Not yet. But people started showing up. Not just reporters, not just lawyers, families. Quiet men and women who drove long hours to stand near the slope or kneel beside the weathered boards of the vault. Some brought flowers. Some brought old photos in frames. Some didn't speak at all, just stood with their hands in their pockets, eyes on the hill, waiting for something no one could give back. I stood with them. Sometimes for minutes, sometimes longer. It wasn't about answers anymore. Not for them. Not really. It was about presence, bearing witness to something that had stayed buried too long. Then, almost suddenly, the legal gears began turning. One former administrator, William Troy, was placed under investigation for obstruction. He was 86. Another sister, Kathleen Rhodes, was located in a convent in upstate New York. She refused comment, but her name appeared in one of the journals written over and over in the margin beside the line. She locked the door from the outside. The investigation reached as far as Nashville, where a supply vendor confirmed they'd delivered bulk orders of linens, medical gauze, and iodine to an off-record annex on behalf of the church. When asked why the records weren't filed with county health, the company rep simply said, "We billed the district." No one asked. By the time the 7th Journal was translated and verified, the list of suspected victims had reached 29. The local papers didn't print all the names, but one radio station read them aloud, slowly, just first names, one by one. It was the first time in decades those names had been spoken in the open. I listened from my truck parked halfway down the gravel road near the vault. The same road I used to walk every morning before school, the same stretch where we used to wait for the bus. The sun was low. The trees were bare. And for a second, the sound of the names on the radio didn't feel like news. It felt like roll call. That night I found another envelope waiting under my windshield. No postage, no handwriting. Inside was a single photo, black and white, slightly blurred. A girl I didn't recognize standing in the same chamber we'd found months ago. She was barefoot, facing the mirror. The reflection showed someone else, taller, standing behind her. But only the girl was visible in the room. I kept that last photo in a drawer for nearly a year. Not locked away, just resting between two pieces of cardboard where the light couldn't reach it. I looked at it sometimes, never for long. Enough to remember the shape of the girl's shoulders, the way her toes curled against the stone floor. Enough to feel the weight of what we didn't say out loud. There were names we recovered, and some we never will. There were files, photographs, testimonies. But none of it adds up to a whole. And maybe that's what lingers most, how close we came and how far the silence still stretches. After the legal group closed their field work, they turned over their findings to a federal task force. The language was vague: historical, institutional neglect, failure of duty, irretrievable data loss. Not one official was charged with direct harm, but they didn't walk away untouched. One resigned. Another entered hospice within the month. And Sister Kathleen, the woman whose name had been written beside so many locked doors, passed before a subpoena reached her. I was told she left no will, no visitors, just a diary with missing pages and a crucifix pressed between them. Rankin retired not long after. Moved out west somewhere quiet. She sent me one last message, a postcard with no return address. It had a photo of the Badlands on the front and on the back 3 words: "They remember you." I still don't know exactly who she meant, but sometimes I think she wasn't just talking about the girls. I've stayed. The farmhouse is old now. Porch sags more than it used to. But I walk the slope each morning just like before. The vault is sealed. The state ordered it filled with concrete siding safety. But I know where it is. I know where the stones shift underfoot. And I still stop there. Just for a moment. I don't say anything. I don't bring flowers. I just listen. Sometimes I think I can hear water. Sometimes it's birds. Sometimes it's nothing at all. But I remember the names. Not all of them. Not perfectly. But enough to know that what happened here wasn't an accident or a failure of paperwork or some tragic misplacement of children. It was built, layered, hidden behind words like obedience and faith, behind walls no one wanted to question. And it stayed buried because it was easier that way. Easier not to look, not to dig, not to listen when a girl says she hears someone singing after lights out. What's left now isn't justice, not really. Most of the ones who should have answered never will. But the truth is out. The silence broke. And if nothing else, those names, those lives, they're not invisible anymore. That matters. If this story stayed with you, share it. Speak their names out loud. Someone always hears. Even if it's just the wind through the trees.